My name is Reinhard Falkenberg. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, the public forum for scholarly discussions and cultural activities of NYU Abu Dhabi. Tonight is the first evening that we present a public lecture here at the Manarat Al Sariyat facility, a great exhibition and conference facility that we are planning to use quite often in this year's program of the Institute. We're spreading our wings. We will also have some events taking place in the Intercontinental Hotel, especially in those months where we cannot have our activities here, but this will be our primary venue. We also have some smaller events taking place in the multipurpose room of our own downtown campus. I'd like to welcome you to a special panel discussion between Jayne Huckerby, Lama Fakih, and Sari Kouvo on A Decade Lost, Locating Gender in US Counter-Terrorism, which is in part at least an outcome of a research enterprise and a workshop that took place the last couple of days organized by NYU Abu Dhabi, and which is also the title of a new report that's coming out on the role of gender and counterterrorism that's going to be offered, I think, publicly to the government of the United States, if I'm not entirely wrong. Tonight's panel discussion will be led by Rahma Abdulkadir. She's a research fellow in the Division of Social Sciences at NYU Abu Dhabi. She received just her PhD. I want to congratulate her with that in May this year. From Texas University at Dallas. And just to give you a flavor of the type of interest that Rahma is interested, the type of interest of her research is the title of her dissertation, which is going to be published, by the way, by University of Toronto Press, is Gender, Transitional Justice, and Failed Statehood. And the underlying research question that she addressed was, can the Somali traditional customary law be the basis for viable and inclusive mechanisms of transitional justice for Somalia? So a very precise and particular politically highly interesting and important question. So we are very glad that we have all four participants to tonight's panel performing, if you will, and engaging in these very important scholarly and political issues, after which, and there's ample time to engage in a discussion with them, and after which we will be able to have some refreshments in the space after that, behind the doors over there. So without any ado, Rahma, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Our first panelist is Jayne Huckerby. Jayne is Research Director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law, where she directs the center's project on gender, national security, and counterterrorism. She's also the co-author of the report that's being launched this evening, titled A Decade Lost, Locating Gender in U.S. Counter-Terrorism. Jayne is also the co-editor of a forthcoming book titled Gender, National Security, and Counterterrorism. She co-authors that book with Professor Meg Satterway. Jayne has worked with various intergovernmental and non-governmental entities, including the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the International Service for Human Rights, and the UN Development Fund for Women. Jayne holds a BA, LLB honors from the University of Sydney, as well as an LLM from the New York University. Our second presenter panelist for the evening is Lama Fakih. Lama is Gender, Human Rights, and Counterterrorism Fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, where she manages the center's project on gender, national security, and counterterrorism. Lama is the co-author of the report that's being launched this evening. Prior to joining the center in 2010, Lama consulted for the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project in Damascus, Syria, where she provided legal assistance to Iraqi refugees seeking resettlement in the United States. Her prior experience, including include working at Women's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch and the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. Lama holds a BA in Middle East Studies from Sarah Lawrence College and a JD from New York University School of Law. Hello. Our third presenter this evening is Sari Kouvo. Sari is the co-director and co-founder of the Afghanistan Analysts Network. She's a human rights lawyer with extensive knowledge of the Afghan justice system and human rights situation. Besides her engagement with the Afghan Analysts Network, Sari teaches international law and related subjects in Brussels. She has previously worked as Senior Program Fellow at the International Center for Transitional Justice, as researcher at Amnesty International, as a human rights and rule of law advisor to the EU Special Representative for Afghanistan. Sari holds a doctorate in international law from Gothenburg University in Sweden, and has also held visiting at the NATO Defense College, Kent University, as well as Australian National University. Welcome, please. I'll pass.
Yeah, thank you, Rama. And welcome everyone to the Abu Dhabi launch of a decade lost locating gender in US counterterrorism. The report was published in July of this year and launched in New York City last week. So we're very excited to be here in Abu Dhabi and thankful to the Abu Dhabi Institute for enabling us to share the findings of the report. As has been mentioned, the report was co-authored by myself and my colleague Lama Fakih and represents the culmination of over 3 years of field research in the US, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in North Africa. As the title of the report would sort of indicate, the focus of our research has really been to look at what have been the gender and human rights impacts of the US counterterrorism effort, both in the United States and also abroad. And while the report covers many different countries, covers many different types of counterterrorism efforts, the overwhelming finding is that in the decade after 9/11, US counterterrorism has profoundly impacted the human rights of women and sexual minorities. In many cases has punished rather than protected women from terrorism. However, for a number of reasons, and some which we will share this evening, the impact has been really off the radar of both the human rights community and policymakers in the United States and abroad, really rendering women the invisible victims of US counterterrorism. Before I get into sharing a couple of the sort of big picture findings from the report, it would be helpful to reflect upon both why we even began to look at the question of gender and counterterrorism, and then how we went about doing so. In terms of the why we even looked at gender and counterterrorism, in the years after 9/11, there have really been two key assumptions that have obscured or blinded attention to the issue of counterterrorism and women. The first has been the idea that counterterrorism is really about impacting men, that men suffer more, whether that be numerically or in terms of the violations suffered in counterterrorism. And so the flip side of that has been, well, if men are the victims of counterterrorism, really women are the victims of terrorism. And so you have a number of governments, in particular the US government, justifying interventions, for example, in Afghanistan, around a narrative of saving women from terrorism. So these two ideas, counterterrorism is about impacting men, and terrorism is about impacting women. And for us, these two ideas really began to break down in 2008, when we were meeting with the female family members of individuals who had been detained by the CIA in its secret detention program. And we really heard firsthand from them about their very separate struggles to locate their loved ones, to try and raise families, to withstand stigma from their communities, and to really become human rights defenders in quite unimaginable circumstances. it was really clear to us that US counterterrorism had had a huge and quite devastating impact on their daily lives, but really that issue was not on anyone's radar at all, particularly not on the radar of the human rights community in the US. As Rahma had mentioned going through our bios, both Lama and I came to work on detention, rendition, interrogation issues from very strong gender backgrounds. And so we really knew that it wasn't tenable for the gender impact of counterterrorism to emerge as a byproduct of other major investigations. We knew we had to have a dedicated project that really asked the gender question, that really asked where is gender coming up in US counterterrorism and where are we seeing a gender impact. We also knew pretty clearly too, again from our backgrounds in this area, that once we began to talk about gender, that really the impact on female family members would be the tip of the iceberg. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. I think the main one of which was really the sheer, the sheer breadth of US counterterrorism. Very early on in the post-9/11 environment, you had a use of what the government calls hard counterterrorism, so rendition, detention, sort of those types of measures. But recently we've seen a real shift toward what is called whole of government approaches, holistic approaches, soft approaches to counterterrorism, which is increasingly seeing areas like development policy, for example, redefined as a national security issue. The breadth of counterterrorism in the US is such that Hillary Clinton in particular has been emphasizing now that promoting the rights of women and girls is itself a counterterrorism measure, without much consideration for what happens when we define promotion of gender equality as a counterterrorism measure rather than an end in and of itself. So really in light of that incredible breadth of counterterrorism, we're really eager to figure out not only looking backward, where have there been violations that have happened in the war on terror, but going forward, how can we ensure that women's rights are not the casualty of a broader holistic approach to countering terrorism? So once we kind of figured out the parameters of what we thought needed to be looked at, the big issue was really one of methodology. How would we begin to delve into an area that's just been so invisible to the human rights community? We decided very early on to take a very much a ground-up approach to the question, and sort of took two tracks. One was very much a government track, so really finding out from US government officials in DC, in the field, what did they think about the impact of what they were doing on women? Did they think about it at all? And if they did, what were the types of things they were thinking about? In that information gathering process, we talked to pretty much every agency of the US government who was involved in doing counterterrorism work. That meant, for example, meeting with the military, meeting with the Department of Treasury, meeting with the FBI, meeting with USAID, meeting with the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, can go on and on and on, but really trying again to figure out from very first-hand information what they thought they were doing in this global war on terror and how it impacted women. We also spoke to a number of other foreign government officials. In particular, Lama and I led an investigation with two of our students in the UK earlier in the year, looking again at how the UK was approaching issues of preventing violent extremism, and again, where the gender question was coming up there. But alongside that track of going after a government perspective, which we thought was really key to these issues, our second track was to figure out from people on the ground, from NGOs, from affected communities, from UN agencies, again, how are the impacts being played out? And the key way that we did that is through a pretty innovative workshop series where we brought together local human rights advocates into a regional workshop setting and asked them to talk about gender and counterterrorism. We held a workshop originally in New York for the US community. We then held one in Nairobi, bringing together folks from Africa, then in Bangkok, and then in Istanbul for Middle East and North Africa. And these were really unique workshops, and we decided very early on that our guiding approach would be not to have a comfortable conversation that we could invite people who we would know would agree with us, and that would be a very lovely way to spend a few days in Istanbul, but that really we need to talk to people who actually would never normally talk to one another. We want to bring into a room, for example, women's advocates from Yemen and Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iraq who had never met one another before. We want to bring into the same room Algerian security experts and human rights advocates from Turkey and see how they would interact and what they'd come out with. And the answer is they came out with a lot of information. The report is very long, as many of you have picked it up would see. I'm not going to have time to go into everything that we found in that report, but I want to highlight sort of 5 patterns or themes that we came across, and then give one example of each pattern to exemplify the gender impact. The very first key finding that we make in the report is that US counterterrorism policies have really failed to protect women from terrorism. In many cases, actually making their situation more insecure and squeezing them between terrorism on the one hand and counterterrorism on the other hand. And that word, squeezing, is a really important word that we heard repeatedly in every workshop. It's a real feeling that rights were being violated by terrorist or fundamentalist groups, but the government was not providing a refuge, was not providing relief for that rights violation, but often compounding that violation. And again, to give a very concrete example of that. The US government has been, over the last number of years, cutting humanitarian aid to Somalia out of fear that the money would be diverted to Al-Shabaab. What we found in our research is actually that those cuts have been disproportionately being borne by women and girls, for 2 reasons. The first of which is that women and girls, due to gender vulnerabilities, bear the brunt of humanitarian crisis. It's a very well-known observation. But secondly, that by cutting off government aid to areas of Somalia, the women and girls are being left dependent on Al-Shabaab for their food distribution. Bear in mind, Al-Shabaab being an entity that had effectively kicked out the UN World Food Programme because the UN World Food Programme gave aid to girls and had female aid workers. That was the very group that women are going to be reliant upon for aid. In other examples, we were told the squeezing effect came about because governments had actually made women's rights an issue in counterterrorism. They had justified intervention in the name of promoting women's rights. And that was, Afghanistan was the key example of that, but also in Pakistan was a very common pattern too. That in that situation, women had been inadvertently set up as targets of terrorist violence. So for example, an attack on a girls' school in Pakistan became akin to an attack on the United States, and that had huge ramifications for the rights of women and girls. The second big finding that we made in the report is that counterterrorism has really weakened civil society. Again, that's a very common observation if you're familiar with the field of human rights and counterterrorism. But what our report really points to is actually those impacts are borne particularly by groups working on gender equality issues. So these are women's groups, for example, that very much rely upon outside funding to be able to do their work. How does it happen? Again, many, many ways and many reasons it happens, but the key one is really via anti-terrorism financing laws. These are laws that at heart are designed to cut off funding to terrorist groups. And so, for example, what the government does is they list an organization as a terrorist group, and that means if you provide any form of support or money, that you're engaging in a criminal act. So what you have in that sort of context is, in the US in particular, if I'm a donor organization, if I want to send money to a particular organization abroad, it's much safer for me if that organization, for example, is large, if the organization has been around for a long time, if they have a nice website where they publish, their board of directors, if they have a very strong public profile in terms of what activities they do. Now, anyone who's sort of worked on gender issues in various countries would know that very often that simply isn't the profile of women's organizations. Women's organizations are often smaller. may not have a public profile that matches what they do, and because they're very often operating in very hard conditions, they're often operating under the radar. So they may not be able to publish, for example, their board directors. They may not be able to publish what trainings they did that month. And so it was really very hard for donors to give money to those types of organizations. Again, them being the ones that most rely upon outside support to be able to do their work. A third pattern that we point to in the report is really the ways in which governments have bartered the rights of women to appease terrorist groups. Again, along with squeezing, the word bartering was one that we heard a lot in our workshops. The most obvious example of that was really in relation to Afghanistan, where there was a concern that despite the invocation of women's rights as a reason for going into Afghanistan, there's going to be a willingness to bargain away women's rights in negotiations with the Taliban as we move toward peace. And Lama's going to go into a little bit more about how that bartering dynamic plays out in other contexts as well. A fourth area where we saw a really huge gender impact was in the redefinition of areas like development, for example, as national security issues. So development has traditionally been a haven or an area where you can try and promote the rights of women. But increasingly, beginning with the Bush administration, but really now at an absolute peak with the Obama administration, we're seeing development is being portrayed as one of the pillars of national security. So you have three pillars of national security in the US. You have defense, development, and diplomacy, the 3 Ds of US counterterrorism. And we began asking the question, okay, well, hang on, what happens when you have that shift? What happens when you have a shift from development based upon need and human rights and protection to development to mitigate risk? What gender dynamic happens in that moment? And what we found, for example, was a very worrying trend of where traditional development money may have gone to women and girls in the community was now going to young men, because young men were thought to be at risk of radicalization. And to give you a very concrete example of that, we looked very closely, excuse me, at a program called G Youth in Kenya. It's in an area in Garissa in Kenya. It's a USAID program. And that community is felt to be of threat to the US government. It's a Somali community. And so what happened in that community is the USAID contractor went in, did a survey of the community needs and found out that very clearly on every indicator of developmental need, so on issues of education, of employment, and so forth, the girls were really faring much worse off than young men in that community. It was really clear there was a very unequal status on every level. But rather than funding development programs for young girls in that community, the counter-terrorism imperative objective meant that money got funneled into the young boys in that community. So you saw an automatic, reinforcing of a gender hierarchy because of the counter-terrorism agenda. So what we were really concerned about, this pattern which we see in Yemen, in Pakistan as well, is really a passing over of women and girls to target young men for enrollment in livelihood programs out of concern that they will otherwise turn to extremism. The final big pattern that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, because I think particularly Sari will help flesh out the gender impact of this, is really that in the decade from 9/11 we've seen a quite marked militarization of counterterrorism. The most obvious manifestations have been in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are very much defined as being in furtherance of US national security. To give an example of the kinds of vulnerabilities that relate in that moment, clearly any type of conflict in this way has very detrimental impacts for the local population, for men and for women. But what we became really interested in was, well, hang on, again, like, are there differential impacts that are being felt by women in these communities? And let's try and talk about what those might be. So outside of Abu Ghraib, outside of Bagram detention facility in Afghanistan, what's happening to the women in these countries? And the answer was like a lot. To give one example of the multitude of vulnerabilities that are created here, at our workshop in the Middle East and North Africa, we were given one pretty compelling example of a young woman, excuse me, from Iraq, who had been trafficked to Dubai, deported back to Iraq as a criminal, and then imprisoned in Iraq. It's very common for trafficking victims to be treated as criminals, first and foremost. And then, because of the shame that she had brought upon her family by virtue of being trafficked, her family sold her to become a suicide bomber. So it's an example of the sort of cycle of violence that had occurred from the invasion, the trafficking that had followed, the return to Iraq, and then the private violence that had been enacted by her family. And we heard these kinds of examples again and again. But I think one thing to really bear in mind that we point to in the report quite a lot is militarization of counterterrorism has not just meant an increased conventional role for the military, so increased combat, for example. What's really meant, and I think this is one of our sort of not anticipated findings when we did the research, was a real seepage of the military into areas where the military has traditionally not been involved. So very much, you know, in the US there's been a separation between the military and the civilian functions of government. What we saw with militarization of counterterrorism is that distinction has been broken down to the point of being virtually non-existent. And to give an example, we saw again and again examples of the US military doing development work. Okay, so that was very clear in combat zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was really also clear in non-combat areas too, such as Africa. And so, for example, right now, AFRICOM, which is the United Africa Command structure for Africa, over half their activities are hearts and minds activities. These are activities designed to help change the attitude of the local population toward the US government. But these are not really things that the US military is used to doing or accustomed to doing. And to give you one example of that we heard quite clearly from both the military and the NGO community. The military had decided that it would engage, US military had decided in Kenya that it would engage in the construction of a series of wells to bring water to a village. Again, the idea being that if you can bring water to a community, you can be interacting with that community, you can change the perception of the community toward the United States. It could also help provide a familiarity such that if there was information from the community to share, they would do and so forth. So anyway, they constructed wells. They sent down a civil affairs team, a team of young US military guys to do the well construction. When they got to the various sort of areas they were going to do the well construction, they didn't consult with women in the community about location of wells and so forth. It's pretty striking from a development perspective. It's a very sort of 101 development lesson that if you're going to do anything involving water, you're going to want to consult women, because women are the ones who are going to be involved in water-bearing activities and so forth. But they came into the community, they consulted with village elders, they consulted with leaders and so forth, and left women out of the equation. They wanted to construct the wells. The well construction was done often in secret. It was done very quickly because they wanted to get this sort of quick impact project happening. Thank you. And as a result, many factors, the wells actually broke. They were faulty, the location wasn't wonderful, and so forth. So in this example, you have a failure of both the developmental activity, but also a hearts and minds activity as well, because clearly that didn't really endear the US government to the local community in any way at all. And so when you have this sort of increasing role of the military doing development work for a hearts and minds objective, women's rights issues are really going to be sidelined in that process. I think to sort of conclude, and before I hand over to Lama, who's going to really go into a few more examples of the patterns that we saw, we really wanted to view the anniversary of 9/11 as an opportunity to take stock, to look at redressing these rights violations, and to ensure going forward that we're more vigilant rather than less vigilant in ensuring that counterterrorism is not used to violate the rights of women.
Thanks, Jayne, and thank you all for joining us. Tonight, in my presentation, I'm going to focus really on 3 trends that we identify in the report that are particularly salient and relevant to the region, given current political situations. So the first is one that Jayne's already highlighted, and that is the bartering of women's rights for short-term security gains. And I'm going to focus on the issue of bartering vis-a-vis the Arab Spring. The second is to discuss the effect that U.S. counterterrorism has actually had on increasing Islamophobia and increasing the vilification of Muslim communities, and the impact that this has then had on women in these communities. And finally, I'm also going to discuss the gendered implications of the U.S. government's efforts to engage with moderate forms of Islam or with moderate Muslims within the context of its overall counterterrorism strategy. So first, with regard to bartering, concerns around bartering occur on two levels as we document them in the report. The first is that we highlight in some instances bartering occurs when the government really trades the rights of women in order to come to some negotiated settlement with a terrorist group. It also occurs as a result of governments privileging counterterrorism relationships with other governments that have poor human rights or gender equality records. So one clear example of this occurred in February 2009 when, following the Pakistani Army's failure to defeat an 18-month Taliban insurgency in the Swat Valley, they came to a negotiated settlement whereby the Pakistani government signed a peace accord with the militants, which enabled them to implement the Taliban's version of Islamic law. And it was understood, it was very clear that this version of Islamic law would be to the detriment of women and girls in this community, which actually what happened as a result. The U.S. government's official stance was to kind of publicly condemn this peace accord, but records indicate that in fact they privately supported its formation. Second, we see that bartering has occurred as a result of the U.S. government's significant investing in authoritarian regimes to advance counterterrorism interests, despite the records these regimes have on democracy, human rights, and gender equality. So this has been the case in a number of Arab states, including, for instance, Egypt and Yemen. And the impacts of these policies continue to reverberate. And there is uncertainty now whether, following some transitions, post-Arab Spring, I think Egypt is a good example of this, whether there will actually be an ushering in of more rights protections for women. With regard to the U.S., importantly, it remains to be seen what the U.S.'s approach will be to women's rights as they engage with new power brokers in the region. In instances now where they may not have the upper hand and where equality agendas may not, in fact, be popular. So here the question is really, will the U.S. abandon its commitment, its professed commitment to women's rights in order to cement these counterterrorism relationships with these emerging governments? Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has stated that the United States will stand firm for women's empowerment and participation in both Tunisia and Egypt post the revolutions, but it is yet to be seen whether this rhetoric will actually be matched with action. There are actually some troubling indications that this may not actually bear out. We have seen, for example, in Egypt, a concern that if a more conservative or more conservative Islamist groups do take up a prominent role in the government, that this may mean that Egyptian women that were actually very active in overthrowing the Mubarak regime will not have a role to play in the political process moving forward. The second trend I want to highlight is how U.S. counterterrorism has served to actually foster an environment marked with increased Islamophobia and vilification of Muslim communities, and also really to emphasize here what the effect has been on women within these communities. As a first example here, just to emphasize, participants across each of our regional workshops each said that the nature of the U.S.'s engagement, the selectiveness and the arbitrariness of that engagement, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, actually served to empower extremist groups and to create terrorism. Indeed, from Somalia to Pakistan to Afghanistan to Iraq, there are countless examples of how terrorists have undermined women's rights and how the U.S. government's counterterrorism measures have actually failed to protect those individuals, and in some instances, how they've made things worse. And Jayne's example from Somalia of Al-Shabaab and Al-Shabaab's controlling of food aid is really indicative of that. The overall and increasing marginalization of Muslim communities as a result of U.S. counterterrorism also puts increased pressure on women in these communities to keep silent about rights violations or to keep silent about their intentions to promote women's rights in their own communities. One participant at our Asia Stakeholder Workshop noted with regard to India that Muslim women's groups are constantly in limbo, as we're always told this is not the right time. When the entire Muslim community is under threat, there's very little space to articulate rights because there's a feeling that you can't make complaints to the police. As a result, Muslim women's groups are very frustrated. In this sense that you can't make complaints, it comes both from a fear of what will happen if you report something to the police, but also a sense that your community is under siege and that you don't want to draw more negative attention to your community as a whole. One additional example here is within the United States, we've seen the increased use of surveillance and investigatory powers against Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And these efforts have really targeted men in these communities, but have actually served to make women in these communities more unsafe. And what we've seen is that the real or perceived targeting of, again, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities has rendered them suspect to other Americans. And one corollary to that is that individuals who are visibly members of these communities, including Muslim women that wear headscarves, are more susceptible to attack. So one of the trends, again, that we highlight in the report is the hate crimes, threats, and discrimination against women in the United States post 9/11. Finally, alongside hard counterterrorism measures, including more kind of militaristic counterterrorism measures like the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the gender implications of which Sari will discuss in a few moments, the US government, as Jayne has explained, is also engaging in a range of soft counterterrorism measures. And one of these measures has been to emphasize the promotion of moderate Muslim voices. These efforts include working with nations the US government considers to exhibit moderate Islamic traditions, such as Bangladesh, or the promotion of moderate authors and textbooks for local schools, for instance, in North Africa and the Sahel region. And the idea is to generate support for the United States and for moderate Islamic viewpoints. Other examples of this engagement in the development context also include instances like the G-Youth program that Jayne also discussed, in which USAID actually works with religious leaders to promote moderate views. So from a gender perspective, engagement with moderate Islam raises a number of concerns, kind of along with the generalized human rights concerns that we would have with the US government engaging in this type of work. First, promotion of moderate religious views, where it is unclear what is encompassed by that term, does not necessarily translate to respect for women's rights. Indeed, it does appear that the US government engages in these initiatives without any consideration for what the impact is on women in these communities. And it actually may serve alongside this example that Jayne mentioned with the wells to actually strengthen particular voices in the community that may be antithetical to women's rights. Thanks. You have?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I have been basically asked to reflect on Jayne's and Lama's report from a more field perspective. And almost a decade in Afghanistan now has provided me with quite a few opportunities to actually see the negative effects of international military intervention. I don't want to take too much time here today, but so I wanted to focus my presentation on two very recent concrete examples. But I think before that, I want to highlight a couple of things that have already come up here today about the kind of rhetoric that was used in 2001 when the US-led military intervention in Afghanistan started, and the kind of rhetoric that is used now about women's rights in Afghanistan. The military intervention in Afghanistan was certainly done only or mainly as retaliation for the attacks on US territory in September 2001, but further sort of legitimization for the intervention was using a language of saving the Afghan people, and particularly saving the Afghan women. So the Bush administration in 2001, late 2001, used a rhetoric very much borrowed from the 1990s international women's movement, talking about ending the gender apartheid against Afghan women and talking about ending the war against women in Afghanistan. As I said, this focus on women's rights was certainly mostly an afterthought to the military intervention. And it's also been a fairly often ill-conceived afterthought. But what has happened is that you've had lots of programs happening in Afghanistan for women's rights, and Afghan women have been able to use some of these programs to open up spaces for themselves to try to change their society. And they've partly used that with the belief that they have a very powerful ally in the international community. And now, 10 years along the line, they suddenly see that the Afghan government is again adopting very conservative laws, without laws that are again limiting women's rights. And these laws are being adopted without the international community reacting in any way. And what they also see is that both the Afghan government and the international community are almost stumbling over each other in order to reach out to the Taliban to get them into a reconciliation process. And now it's much, I certainly believe that there has to be a political settlement to the conflict in Afghanistan, but I think the Afghan women's rights activists are very, very right to be very concerned about what price they will be paying for that reconciliation, because if women's rights were an afterthought in 2001, they are certainly not at the agenda in any way in 2011. So I now want to sort of turn to two very practical examples, or recent examples, or examples of something, the issues that have been talked about here today. And Jayne mentioned earlier that we often view men as the primary victims of terrorism and counter-terrorism. So I want to use one example though about the very direct effects on men, but then looking at also at the more sort of obscure or complex effects on women. So my first example, and this is in August this year, the Taliban staged a suicide attack in Uruzgan. This is one of the more conflict-ridden provinces in southern Afghanistan. What they tried to do was enter the governor's compound through a local television station. Around the midday, the Americans staged a counter-attack. At this point, all the suicide attackers were dead, but hiding in the bathroom of the television station was Umayyad, who was the local news reporter. And he was then killed by the Americans in the counterattack. The recently released NATO report explains that Umayyad had a beard and was on the location of the attack. So the soldier had reason to believe that he posed a threat. Umayyad had what best can be described as a designer stubble. Certainly not a beard, anything that would go for a beard by Uruzgan standards. And yes, he was on the location of the attack. He was, during midday, at his workplace, where he was going to present the news on the local television a few hours later. So our analysis, in our analysis of this case, we basically said that the gloves are off. The message to all young Afghan civilian males out there is, be afraid, be very afraid. And this is actually, if we look at the kind of security trainings that are to get, security trainings provided for Afghan journalists and others, what they've been saying for a long time, if you get caught up in an attack, the most dangerous phase for you will be the release. So if you stay alive till the release, you better sort of hold your hands very high up and speak very clear English if you want to stay alive. So that was an effect of the sort of effects on men. And I should say, because we've written quite a lot about this killing of this journalist, and from many Afghans we've had the reaction, of course you're right about him, he was a journalist, but what about all the unknown men that are dying? So my second example is about effects on girls and women. And this is also very recent. Last week there was an article in Afghan newspaper about and it discussed a sort of plague of sexual violence against girls and women in Tahar province. Tahar province is in northern Afghanistan, and it's one of the, at least on the surface, calmer provinces. And and apparently in Tahar, you've had then cases of girls or women being violated by what they think are police officers. In one of the cases, a 12-year-old girl was allegedly raped by 8 uniformed men. And speaking to local media, the girl's family said that that if they would tell the names of the family of the perpetrators, they would risk being killed, because they knew that the perpetrators are linked to the local strongman police chief. It goes without saying that in a conservative rural context in Afghanistan, this girl's life is more or less destroyed. She won't be able to get married, and she will stay a burden for her family unless she finds any ways of making money and then contributing to her family. But it's also pretty certain that a couple of cases like this in a province will also have effects for all other girls and women in that province, because parents wanting to protect their girls will be pulling the girls out of school and keeping them at home, and also will probably be asking sisters, wives and mothers not to go to work anymore because it's too dangerous for them. And once the decision has been taken to pull a girl out of school, then the decision to send her back to school is one that will be much more difficult to take. So, why is this case relevant for the analysis about gender and counter-terrorism? We have cases of police violence everywhere. Well, most likely, these police officers were not real police. Most likely, they were what is now called Afghan local police, one of several ad hoc militia type security structures that have been created by the Afghan government, funded by the international community, in order to create a community protection force, community protection force that the theory has it should fight the Taliban. Well, these local militias are or this local defense force is usually young men loyal to the local strongman, who are then recruited, given a couple of months training, and given a uniform, a new gun, and being paid, obviously getting a salary, and then being sent out to protect the communities. Anybody of us or most of us who have at some point worked on issues of security sector reform in conflict or post-conflict situations would know that giving young men guns and uniforms without integrating them into a proper structure, command and control structure, is definitely not conducive for security sector reform, and it's also certainly not conducive for stability. One of the effects in Afghanistan has been a rise of sexual violence, at least in this specific province. So, by way of conclusion, I mean, you speak about decade lost, and in December, Afghanistan will have had a decade of military intervention, and it will be moving into a second decade of military intervention as most likely a much more dangerous place than it was 10 years ago, and certainly with no real end in sight for the violence and the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we will open it for the public to ask questions. So my first question is for Jayne. Jayne, so if you were to underscore specific, significant findings of the report, what would you say those are?
Thank you, Rahma. I think one of the most significant findings I've sort of hinted at already has been trying to analyze the implication from a human rights perspective of this more holistic approach to countering terrorism. So, very often at the UN level, at the US level, in the UK and other governments, there's this real embracing of a whole of government approach, of a soft approach, and actually in the human rights community too, an appreciation of a move away from purely hard counter-terrorism. But I think a complete under-theorization of what that actually means for women's protection. So I think drawing attention to that, and particularly looking at development, was a major contribution of the report. A second kind of big area where the report goes into very new and very important directions is to highlight the failure of the US government to evaluate the impact of its activities, and not only the impact on human rights, which is one question, but even the impact on whether counter-terrorism is achieving the goal of countering terrorism. So again and again, we would ask, government officials, well, how do you know if what you're doing is working, or how do you know if what you're doing is impacting on human rights? And a very common answer was, well, you can't measure that. We can't measure whether a preventive activity had the impact we wanted to have. It's like measuring a negative. We heard that like a lot. And so I think that resolute failure to engage in measuring the effectiveness of counter-terrorism on terrorism was definitely a stark finding, but then to show that the question of impact on human rights is even further removed from that.
Thank you, Jayne. So my second question is for Lama, and the question is, what are you calling on to the U.S. government to do? What would you tell the government to do to fix this?
So I'm going to focus on some of the recommendations we make in the report specific to the trends that I spoke about. So with regard to bartering, one of the points that we make in the report is that women's rights promotion really counts, really matters, and that the US government, when it uses the rhetoric of women's rights and does not actually follow through in its engagements in advancing women's rights, that they actually make things worse, that they actually serve to set women up as victims of terrorists, as targets of terrorist violence. So we make the recommendation that the US government should actually follow through in its commitment to women's rights, and more specifically that in its engagements with other countries to not kind of prop up authoritarian regimes, but rather to do more to create space for civil society actors to develop their own local movements, to not insist on setting the agenda, but rather creating space for local actors to set their own agenda and to support that work. Throughout kind of our workshops, we heard again and again from a number of individuals that it was important that the US government kind of not be hypocritical in its engagement, but actually reinforce good governance measures and not actually prop up authoritarian regimes which were actually working to the disservice of gender equality movements in those contexts. With regard to kind of engaging Muslim communities, there, particularly in the United States now, is a lot of concern with the human rights, within the human rights community, of the manner in which the US government is engaging Muslim communities. And we make the recommendation that the US government desecuritize its engagement with Muslim communities so that these communities aren't identified as suspect vis-a-vis the rest of the population, and also so that we don't have the same kinds of impacts that I identified in which minority voices in the community are silenced because they feel like they're under siege.
Thank you, Lama. So my final question is for Sari. And Sari, you mentioned something about political settlement and its potential possible impacts on women's rights in Afghanistan. Can you tell us what the political settlement would mean for women's rights in Afghanistan?
That's a very, very big question. I think, as I said, there's been quite a lot of attention on women's rights over the past decade, and this attention has gone down over the past years or so. We can also see it in numbers. There's actually less women in, not counting the parliament, but in high-level government positions in Afghanistan today than there was in 2002, 2003. But if we think about possible, if there is now a political settlement, then I think that there will be lots of negotiation done around the type of that settlement, but there will also during that time be quite a lot of international attention, if not from governments, so for international women's movements and so forth. But I think the dangerous moment will be a few years after the political settlement, when in a way the conservative forces that are now in the Afghan government find their way together with a possible Taliban political force in the government, and what these then will be doing together in order to squeeze women and certainly other minorities out from positions of power or out from any form of decision-making positions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we should actually look at the blinding obvious points of women's rights within the Middle East and Asia as well. We're looking at women's rights within the context of military occupation within Iraq and also within Afghanistan. In addition to that, we're looking at women's rights within the context of the West supporting dictatorships around the world. So when we look at, for example, America entering Afghanistan, there's been an increase in the number of women which have been raped. There's been an increase of prostitution. There's been an increase in terms of drugs and so forth. And the safety of the women in those countries is dramatically decreased. Same thing within Iraq. You've got the same situation there. And I'm sure you've heard about how women have been forced into prostitution to satisfy the sexual demands of the US military over there. So I believe that we should allow the men and women within these countries to decide their own destiny based on their own values and cultures, rather than trying to impose values which the individuals in those countries don't believe. Thank you very much.
We'll collect a few questions. Professor Gordon.
Thank you for this report, because from your report on the report, it sounds extremely impressive and a tremendous gathering of material, and I particularly appreciated your questions, your talking about gender in terms of men and those problems. But I want to raise another question just to see how you respond to it, although it may be moving a little bit away from counterterrorism per se, and that is that I wonder if the people involved in counterterrorism, who are genuinely, no doubt, thinking about women's rights, are not defining women's rights in a very narrow way, in a way that could be and has been labeled Western. And I think particularly about what I read about what women's rights advocates in Africa are saying about talking about women's rights on the one hand, but on the other hand, promoting a neoliberalization policy of structural adjustment and privatization and cutting services and so on, which means that their children's education is now beyond their reach, their medical care is now beyond their reach, and these are very, very fundamental concerns of women. And so a policy that doesn't look at those kinds of concerns about women, I again raise the question not only about whether it's effective against terrorism, but what does it mean to define women's rights in such a relatively narrow way?
She thinks the perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. This was very, very interesting. I'm very glad I came. At the beginning, you talked a lot about development and how this development is being worked into the terrorism. And I also was very interested looking at your chapter 8 here of actually measuring and the tools. And it has to do with also with this last lady's comment, which is about the economics in this. I think that one of the things, certainly, where is the money going, how is the money being used, is very, very important. And indeed, under, the economics that goes along with bringing these countries in, for example, now in Egypt or in, the countries that have the revolution, what kind of economics are they going to have? Because this is also very, very important and how it impacts women, and it doesn't have to do so much as bringing Western type, let's say, feminism into the countries. It's not about that. It's about women's rights, which are the same in the U.S., in Mexico, or in the Middle East. It's exactly the same. It's beyond what a rape is a rape, no matter where. This is what it's about. Okay, thank you.
We'll answer the first three, and then we'll take 3 questions at a time, if that's okay.
Maybe I'll begin to. I think actually there's a lot of overlap between the questions here. I think the first comment and question go together perfectly. The issue being what version of women's rights is being promoted here. And I think what you find when you talk to US counterterrorism officials is very much a recognition that they are not always accessing the community perspective on what rights should look like. In the sense that there's a real information gap and a real barrier between the formation of US counterterrorism policy and how that's perceived by affected communities. That barrier comes from a number of things. One obvious one is if you're a women's advocate working on these issues in your country, your work is already going to be labelled as Western and foreign and so forth, and so you're not going to want to be seen talking to a US counterterrorism person. And so there's a real lack of consultation and communication happening there. And one thing that we call for in response to the very first comment, that we call for very clearly in the report, first and foremost, is the need for consultation. That, to consult with stakeholders to understand that there are varying perspectives on what rights look like in that moment and what would be helpful and what would be harmful. There are many examples of overtly promoting a Western version of human rights funded by the US government is going to cause huge backlash in communities. That's another word we've heard a lot, with backlash from women's groups. I'm going to take us over to the other question and hand on to you as well. The economic question is huge. Follow the money question is very much complicated in the context of counterterrorism, again, primarily because of the ways in which the military has been so involved in the counterterrorism effort. One of the programs that we looked at, for example, and many of the programs rather, in development, are actually funded by military money. It's called 1207 money. And 1207 money comes with a lot of strings not attached to it, in that it's very hard to figure out where it went. There's very little reporting on spending that money in the same way that you have to have reporting on aid money otherwise. And so the issue of economic looms very large, but at the same time it's the biggest challenge because, to be able to trace where very large pools of money go on the ground is very hard, including because very often the government is quite aware that it can't have a very obvious footprint in various countries, and so it's working through NGO networks, working through local governments and funneling money, in that way that can make it very hard to identify the end outcome.
I'm going to give just a couple of examples that I think that come out of our workshops that I think speak to the comments and the questions that were raised. When we were in Thailand, we met with some local actors that were speaking about, the U.S. government is engaged in South Thailand. They're providing trainings to women on how to kind of negotiation skills. And the response from women in that community was, we don't need negotiation skills training. We need training on how to market our goods so that we can become economically independent. Another example came from our Asia workshop. A Bangladeshi women's rights activist was saying, in response to this issue that the US government is using arguments of advancing women's rights within the Islamic legal framework in order to avoid issues of backlash. She was saying, within our local movements, we use a human rights framework. If the US government comes in and starts talking about promotion of women's rights within an Islamic legal framework, she saw that as an erosion of the advancements that they had made. So I think we see a number of instances where the US government has identified the importance of engaging women within its counterterrorism context, but they're doing it in a way that, as Jayne said, kind of fails to consult with the local actors and fails to allow them to set their agendas and their priorities, and as a result we see an undermining of women's rights.
Probably just, I could probably not agree much more with the two first questions, and I do think that you mentioned the notion of being squeezed, and I do think that many sort of the women who are working for women's rights or working for change in their communities in Afghanistan very much now feel squeezed, not only between terrorists and the international military, but actually between different ideas about women's rights, about the demands of let's say, USAID funding on the one hand, and the demands of what is a woman's role within their communities, and being able to make use of international funding, which comes with certain frameworks, at the same time as not losing their face or losing the credibility in their communities, does take a lot of very good balancing from some of the Afghan women's rights activists.
Thank you so much for the excellent dialogue. Part of my question is already answered, so I'll keep it short. I think identification of women rights in different societies is important, because there are certain aspects which cannot be negotiated, which cannot be compromised, which is probably education and inclusion in government and governance. And then there are certain other factors which are which have a back end linked to the society, the culture, the religion, and all those aspects. I think why identification of the important aspects is important, because when you go into that common ground of negotiation, where you're talking to the stakeholders, and you're on a ground where you can compromise on a few things, but you cannot compromise on others. I think it's very critical that from the perspective of the local community, you understand which are those critical factors, those 3 or 4 critical factors where you do not want to compromise. So, I mean, for me, obviously, I would not say that my comment is comprehensive, but maybe from your side, if you can identify 3 or 4 components which you feel cannot be compromised in let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yes, can you hear me? Right. Just want to make one point and one question as well. Throughout Islamic history, I've never come across any problems encountered in the Muslim community with women being under a form of oppression. I think it's become quite apparent more in the last 80 to 90 years, where the role of women has become more questionable. So I think there's something that needs to be studied in that, what has changed in the last 100 years for that to happen. I think the second point, which is a question, is I think it's fine to talk about the role of the women in the East, so to speak, and the way the American government views the role of women. But so we need to ask ourselves the question as well as, how does the American government view the role of women in terms of how it treats them as well? Most notably, I mean, I heard one of you mention that you were talking about the role of women just outside of Abu Ghraib prison, but what was the situation of the women inside Abu Ghraib prison? How were they being treated by the American army there? There have been several cases in recent years, most notably of Somali women in Somalia bearing children from British soldiers. And I think most recently, a famous case is the case of Dr. Afia Siddiqui, who is actually an educated professional, but was held without charge for a very long time, and kept away from the family. And these kind of questions need to be asked from another viewpoint as well.
Question? No? Okay.
Question on compromise?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first, you actually answered your own question, I think, which rights cannot be compromised, or at least I would say that I would agree very much with your assessment. If we ensure that women have the right to political participation, that women can actually get into decision-making forums, and if we also ensure that women have the right to education and have the right to seek employment, and that they can, in a way, do all this in a situation where their society will react if they are using their rights and somebody tries to violate them. For example, as in the case with the sexual violence against the 12-year-old girl. I mean, then we have a sort of basic framework from within the women of that society, together with the men who think like them, etc., can start defining their own framework. But that's, for me, that's a minimum. Yeah.
I think if I can add, I mean, I think the question of compromise can get very quickly into one of battering. You need to be very careful. A number of times we heard an argument, a policy argument, that the US government should refrain from doing gender programming in a community out of fear of inflaming extremist components in the community. But that choice that was set up, you know, between gender and peace or security was often a very instinctive one, based upon a belief about the community and what they would want. And like what we really stress in the report is, you know, very often the question of compromise will be much more nuanced than it has been presented. And it's very important to assess, you know, what is the trade-off that's being talked about here, and to get away from thinking there are some things that can be exchanged in order for short-term security.
To respond to the question about the importance of looking at how the U.S. government treats women, I think probably all of us could not agree with you more. What we do in the report is try to highlight ways in which women are directly impacted as targets of U.S. counterterrorism. So for instance, we do highlight Dr. Siddiqui's case. We do discuss in depth sexual violence in U.S. detention facilities, but also try to broaden the scope to look at ways in which women are collaterally impacted when, for instance, their male family member is detained or disappeared, or as a result of targeted killings, displacement that results. One comment went to the impact that the war in Iraq has had on creating an insecurity situation for women in that country, which has resulted, again, in mass displacement and increases of prostitution and trafficking. So absolutely, that's something that we raise in the report and highlight, that the accountability failures within the war on terror also extend to the rights violations perpetrated against women as part of that.
I think we would add that we recognize actually in the report that the picture of US treatment of female detainees is very incomplete. I think to put that, you can't overstate that. I think there's been attention to, for example, interrogation of men, but very little public attention and documentation to the issue of treatment of women. So I think you've identified a huge blind spot in the human rights community and in the government as well, that really needs to be addressed.
I think we'll conclude for the evening. Thank you all for attending, and thank you so much to our presenters this evening.